Thank you, Yolanda. Now, all this is yours. In New Orleans' sultry glow, where jazz hums and magnolias whisper, Yolanda, a radiant black woman with sleek, flowing hair, chose love over wealth. A celebrated boutique owner, she fell for Matthew, a humble white carpenter defying scornful whispers. A heart-shaking secret looms. A grand church shimmers with light as Yolanda glides in a dazzling white gown, her gaze fierce with resolve. The crowd hushes as Matthew, her groom, seizes the microphone. A colossal screen blazes, revealing $1 billion fortune, a youth center in Yolanda's name, and the words, "All this wealth is yours forever." A children's choir soars. Matthew declares, "I'm a tech billionaire." The hall erupts and Yolanda weeps. What trials shape this moment? Can love conquer all doubts? Stay to unravel their journey. Rate this tale 1 or 0. The air in New Orleans thrummed with life, a sultry symphony of jazz spilling from Bourbon Street's neon-lit bars, mingling with the sweet scent of magnolias and the faint tang of Creole spices. Cobblestone alleys glowed under gaslight lanterns, and the Mississippi River murmured secrets to the night. In this city of soul and swagger, where wealth and status reigned supreme, Yolanda Carter walked with a grace that turned heads. Her long, straight hair cascaded like a midnight river, catching the glow of streetlights as she moved through the French Quarter. A black woman in her prime, her beauty was matched only by her success. A boutique owner whose designs adorned the elite, her penthouse a testament to her empire. Yet beneath the glamour, Yolanda carried a quiet ache. The world of glittering galas and shallow suitors left her hollow, yearning for a love untainted by her fortune. She stood in her boutique, Yolanda's elegance, its walls lined with silks and sequins that sparkled like stars. The shop was her sanctuary, a place where she crafted dreams into dresses, but tonight, as she locked the door, her thoughts drifted. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Marry a man who matches your wealth, Yolanda. Don't settle." Her brother Jamal had been blunter. "You're a queen. Find a king with a crown, not a fool with nothing." Their words stung, not because they doubted her, but because they didn't understand. Yolanda didn't want a crown. She wanted a heart that saw hers. The night market pulsed nearby, a kaleidoscope of vendors and musicians under strings of fairy lights. Yolanda wandered in, drawn by the rhythm of a street band's trumpet. Stalls brimmed with handmade jewelry and voodoo charms, the air alive with laughter and haggling. She paused at a booth displaying carved wooden figurines, each etched with stories of the bayou. A man stood behind the stall, his white skin dusted with sawdust, his faded flannel shirt rolled at the sleeves. His hands, calloused yet gentle, cradled a half-finished carving of a heron. He looked up, and his blue eyes met hers, steady, warm, unguarded. "Beautiful work," Yolanda said, her voice soft but curious. "Did you make these?" The man smiled, a quiet curve that lit his face. "Everyone. They're stories from the river, carved to last." His voice was low, like the hum of a distant storm, and carried no pretense. "I'm Yolanda," she offered, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Matthew," he replied, setting the heron down. "Just a carpenter who likes to tell tales with wood." Their conversation flowed like the Mississippi itself, effortless, deep, meandering through art, dreams, and the city's heartbeat. Matthew spoke of restoring old Creole cottages, of children he taught woodworking to at a local school. He didn't boast or preen, unlike the men who flaunted Rolexes at her galas. Yolanda felt a spark, a flicker of something real in a world of facades. As she left, a vendor nearby whispered to another, "Yolanda Carter with that carpenter? She's got money to burn, and he's got nothing but splinters." The words slithered through the crowd, sharp with judgment. Yolanda caught them but walked on, her chin high. She'd heard worse, whispers about her ambition, her blackness, her refusal to play by society's rules. Let them talk. She'd built an empire on her own terms. Days later, at a poetry slam in a dimly lit Creole cafe, Yolanda saw Matthew again. The room buzzed with spoken word, the air thick with chicory coffee and passion. He sat in the back, listening intently, his worn boots tapping to the rhythm. When their eyes met, he waved her over, offering a chair. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said, his smile easy. "I love stories," Yolanda replied, settling beside him. "Yours seem worth hearing." They talked through the night, sharing laughs over beignets and dreams under the cafe's tin ceiling. Matthew spoke of his love for New Orleans history, of fixing broken things, houses, hearts, hopes. Yolanda shared her exhaustion with the elite's empty promises, her desire for a life rooted in truth. The crowd thinned, but their connection deepened, a quiet fire kindling. The next week at a school fundraiser, Yolanda spotted Matthew repairing a classroom's splintered desks, his hands steady as he worked. She joined him, handing out art supplies to kids, their laughter a balm to her soul. "You're good with them," she said, watching him teach a boy to sandwood. "They remind me life's simple," Matthew replied, his eyes soft. "Just needs care, not cash." But the whispers grew louder. At a boutique event, a rival designer, Simone, sneered, "Yolanda's slumming it with that white carpenter. Her brand will tank." Customers murmured, glancing at Yolanda's latest designs with doubt. Her mother called that night, her voice sharp. "You're a black woman who's made it. Don't throw it away on a nobody." Jamal texted, "He's got no money, sis. Wake up." Yolanda's heart tightened, but she pushed back. "You don't know him," she told her mother, her voice firm. "Money doesn't make a man." She hung up, staring at a photo Matthew had sent, a carved heron, its wings spread. It was a gift left at her boutique with a note. For Yolanda, who soars. Her resolve hardened. Society could judge, but her heart saw something they didn't. Then came the first test. Matthew met her at the riverfront, his face shadowed. "I owe some money," he admitted, pulling out papers that looked like loan documents. "A project for kids' art classes went south. I'm behind a few thousand." His voice was heavy, but his eyes searched hers. Yolanda's instinct was to offer her wealth, but Matthew shook his head. "I'll fix this myself. I just wanted you to know." Her heart swelled at his honesty, even as her mother's warnings echoed. She touched his hand. "We'll face it together," she said, her voice steady. The city's gossip grew venomous. Simone spread rumors that Yolanda's boutique was funding a loser's debts, denting her sales. A neighbor hissed, "A black queen with a broke white guy? She's lost her mind." Yolanda ignored them, but the weight pressed harder. Matthew's quiet strength kept her anchored, his carvings piling up in her office, each a story, each a promise. As they walked the quarter one evening, jazz notes swirling, Yolanda felt a truth settle in her bones. Matthew was no king with a crown, but he was hers. She didn't know the storm brewing, the secrets he carried, or the grand reveal waiting. But in that moment, under the New Orleans stars, love was enough. Yolanda's heels clicked against the polished oak floor of her boutique. Yolanda's elegance, the air heavy with the scent of silk and ambition. Her long, straight hair swayed as she adjusted a mannequin draped in her latest design, a gown of midnight velvet that shimmered like her resolve. Matthew's carved heron sat on her desk, its wings a silent promise amidst the chaos brewing in her heart. His confession about a small debt lingered, a pebble in the current of their budding love. Yet it only deepened her trust. She saw the weight in his blue eyes, the pride of a man who refused her wealth, and it stirred something fierce in her, a belief that love could anchor them against any storm. But New Orleans, with its judgmental pulse, had other plans. The city's whispers grew sharper, like knives glinting in the French Quarter's gaslight glow. At a gala for local entrepreneurs, Yolanda stood radiant in one of her own creations, her presence commanding despite the sidelong glances. Simone, her rival designer, slithered through the crowd, her smile venomous. "Yolanda's taken up with a broke carpenter," she purred to a group of socialites, her voice loud enough to carry. "A black queen like her, dragging her brand through the mud for a white nobody." The words cut, not because Yolanda cared for their opinions, but because they tarnished the man she was falling for. Her fingers tightened around her champagne flute, her heart a drumbeat of defiance. She wouldn't let them tarnish Matthew. Back at her penthouse overlooking the Mississippi's silver ripples, Yolanda paced. Matthew had joined her after his day's work, sawdust clinging to his flannel, his hands rough but gentle as he took hers. I heard what they're saying, he said, his voice low, like a storm brewing over the bayou. Does it hurt you, Yolanda, being tied to someone like me? Her brown eyes locked onto his, fierce and unwavering. They don't know you, Matthew. They see a carpenter. I see a man who carves stories from wood, who fixes broken things for kids. That's worth more than their gossip. Her words were a shield, but inside a flicker of doubt stirred. Not in him, but in the world's cruelty. Could love alone silence their scorn? The next evening, they met at a quiet jazz club, its walls alive with murals of Creole legends. The saxophone wailed, mirroring Yolanda's heart as Matthew slid a worn envelope across the table. It's worse than I thought, he said, his jaw tight. The debt's grown. 20,000 now. The art program for those kids. I miscalculated. His eyes, usually so steady, flickered with shame, and Yolanda's chest ached. The papers, creased and official looking, detailed a loan for a failed community project. She didn't know they were a fabrication, a test Matthew had woven to see if her love would hold. I can help, she said instantly, her voice soft but firm. My boutique's doing well. Let me... No, Matthew cut in, his tone sharp with pride. I won't take your money, Yolanda. This is my burden. His refusal stung, but it also lit a fire in her. He wasn't like the men who courted her for her wealth, their smiles as hollow as their promises. Matthew's honor, his raw sincerity, made her love him more. But the world outside their jazz-soaked haven was relentless. Simone's rumors spread like wildfire, and Yolanda's boutique felt the burn. Regular clients canceled orders, whispering about her poor judgment. At a coffee shop, a woman Yolanda barely knew leaned in, her voice dripping pity. A black woman like you, with everything, why throw it away on a white guy who can't pay his bills? Yolanda's smile was steel. I'm not throwing anything away. I'm choosing what matters. But the words lingered, heavy as the humid air, and her heart churned with the weight of defending a love others couldn't see. Her family's disapproval was a deeper wound. At a tense dinner in her mother's Garden District home, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and ancestral portraits, Yolanda faced their judgment. Her mother, elegant and unyielding, set down her fork. Yolanda, you're a Carter. We fought for this legacy. Why risk it for a man with nothing but debts and a hammer? Her brother Jamal leaned forward, his voice low. He's white, broke, and trouble. You're letting love blind you. Yolanda's fingers trembled around her glass, but her voice held firm. You're wrong about him. Matthew's heart is richer than any legacy. I'd rather have his love than a fortune built on pretense. She left the table, her mother's silence louder than words, her heart aching but resolute. She wouldn't waver, not when Matthew's quiet strength felt like home. The next day, Simone escalated her attack. A scathing article appeared in a local fashion magazine, hinting that Yolanda's reckless choices were sinking her brand. Yolanda's elegance teeters on ruin, it read, as its owner funds a carpenter's failures. Sales plummeted, and Yolanda spent sleepless nights poring over finances, her dreams fraying at the edges. Yet when Matthew brought her a new carving, a magnolia blossom, its petals delicate as hope, she felt her resolve reignite. For you, he said, his voice soft, to remind you we're stronger than their words. Their evenings became a refuge. At a riverside bench under the glow of a crescent moon, they shared stories, hers of designing gowns that told black women's stories, his of rebuilding homes after hurricanes. But Matthew's silences grew heavier, his eyes darting to his phone when he thought she wasn't looking. Just work stuff, he'd say, but Yolanda sensed a shadow behind his smile. Was it just the debt or something deeper? She pushed the thought away, clinging to the warmth of his hand in hers. One night, as they walked through the quarter, a man in a suit approached Matthew, speaking in hushed tones before glancing at Yolanda. Business associate, Matthew explained, but his voice was too quick. The encounter left a knot in her stomach, but she buried it. She loved him, his carvings, his laughter, his heart. The world could whisper, Simone could scheme, but Yolanda wouldn't falter. Yet the storm was gathering. Simone's next move was ruthless, a whispered tip to a supplier, claiming Yolanda couldn't pay her bills. Orders stalled, And Yolanda faced a choice: dip into her savings to save her boutique or let it falter. She chose to fight, but her heart whispered a quiet fear. Matthew's debt was a weight, and though she'd never admit it, the city's scorn was wearing her down. Still, she looked at him, his calloused hands carving her name into a piece of oak, and knew she'd face anything for him. The path ahead was uncertain, but Yolanda's love was a beacon. She didn't know the trials Matthew was weaving, the secrets he held, or the grand stage he was setting. For now she held his hand, the jazz of New Orleans their anthem, and faced the world's fire with a heart ablaze. Yolanda stood on the balcony of her penthouse, the Mississippi River glittering below like a ribbon of starlight, its current a mirror to her churning heart. The city's pulse, jazz notes drifting from distant bars, the clatter of horse-drawn carriages, felt both alive and oppressive. Matthew's carved magnolia blossom rested in her hands, its petals a fragile anchor against the storm of whispers tearing at her world. His confession of a $20,000 debt, tied to a failed art program for kids, had only deepened her resolve, but the cost was mounting. Her boutique, Yolanda's Elegance, was bleeding clients, stung by Simone's venomous rumors. The weight of her choice to love a man deemed unworthy pressed hard, yet Yolanda's heart burned with defiance. Matthew's quiet strength, his refusal to take her money, made her love him fiercer. Even as the city's scorn and her family's silence carved wounds, she hid behind a radiant smile. She met Matthew the next evening at a quiet oyster bar in the Bywater, its wooden tables scarred by time, the air thick with the briny tang of the Gulf. He sat across from her, his flannel shirt dusted with sawdust, his blue eyes shadowed with a guilt she couldn't name. "I'm sorry, Yolanda," he said, his voice rough as the oyster shells between them. "The debt's worse now. 50,000. The program, it's a mess." He slid a crumpled loan document across the table, its numbers stark and accusing. Yolanda's breath caught, not at the sum, but at the pain etched in his face. She didn't know the papers were a lie, a carefully crafted test to measure her heart's resolve. Her fingers trembled as she touched the document, but her voice was steady. "We'll face it together, Matthew. I don't care about the money." Her words were a vow, born of a love that saw beyond the city's judgment. Inside, though, her heart ached, not from doubt in him, but from the toll of defending their bond. She'd sold designs to cover his earlier debt, and now her boutique teetered, Simone's article in the fashion magazine a dagger in her reputation. Yolanda's Elegance falters, it had declared, painting her as a fool chasing a broke man's dreams. Yet looking into Matthew's eyes, she saw a future worth fighting for. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm not worth your empire." The words pierced her, not because she believed them, but because they revealed his fear, that he was dragging her down. Yolanda leaned closer, her gaze fierce. "You're worth everything to me. Let them talk. They don't know us." Her heart swelled with a love that felt like rebellion, a fire against the world's cold disdain. But the world struck back. At a charity auction for New Orleans' historic preservation, Yolanda arrived in a gown of her own design, its ebony silk hugging her curves like a second skin. The crowd's whispers followed her, sharp as bayou thorns. "She's throwing it all away for that white carpenter," a socialite hissed. "A black woman like her should know better." The racial sting cut deep, layering shame atop scorn. Simone, glittering in a rival gown, approached with a smirk. "Your boutique's dying, Yolanda. Pity, all for a man who can't pay his way." Yolanda's smile was a blade. "My heart's richer than your lies, Simone." But inside, her confidence wavered, the weight of lost clients and canceled orders pressing like a stone on her chest. Her family's rejection was a heavier blow. At a tense brunch in her mother's mansion, surrounded by velvet drapes and the clink of fine china, Yolanda faced their fury. Her mother, regal in her grief, set down her teacup. "You're a Carter, Yolanda. Our name means power. This Matthew, he's dragging you into ruin." Jamal, her brother, slammed his fist on the table. "He's white, broke, and a liability. You're killing your legacy for a fantasy." Yolanda's throat tightened, tears pricking her eyes, but she stood tall. "You're wrong," His love is my legacy. I'd rather lose everything than lose him. She left, their silence a chasm, her heart bruised but unbroken. The city's cruelty didn't relent. Simone's next move was a calculated strike, a whispered campaign to suppliers, claiming Yolanda's boutique was insolvent. Two major fabric vendors pulled their contracts, and Yolanda spent nights crunching numbers, her dreams fraying like cheap thread. She hid her fears from Matthew, but they seeped into her quiet moments, her fingers tracing the magnolia carving as if it could hold her together. She loved him, his gentle laughter, his stories of fixing broken homes, his refusal to let her wealth define him. But the cost of that love was steep, and doubt crept in, not about him, but about her strength to carry it. One evening, as they walked along the levee, the river's murmur a soft counterpoint to their silence. Matthew stopped. His face was taut, his eyes avoiding hers. "I saw a lawyer today," he said, his voice barely audible. "The debt, it's spiraling. I might lose everything." He pulled out another document, this one detailing a lien on his small workshop, a fake but convincing threat. Yolanda's heart sank, not for the money, but for the anguish in his voice. She took his face in her hands, her touch fierce. "We'll fight this, Matthew. You're not alone." Her words were a lifeline, but inside she felt the strain, her empire crumbling under Simone's lies in the city's judgment. Yet in that moment, Matthew's touch grounded her. He pulled her close, his breath warm against her hair. "You're my strength, Yolanda," he whispered, but his eyes held a shadow, a secret he couldn't yet share. She didn't see the guilt flickering there, the weight of his deception as he tested her love. To her, he was a man fighting to rise above his burdens, and she'd stand by him, no matter the cost. The levee stretched before them, the city's lights a constellation of hope and hostility. Yolanda clung to Matthew's hand, her heart a battlefield of love and fear. Simone's schemes, her family's rejection, and the growing debt loomed like storm clouds, but her love was a flame that refused to flicker. She didn't know the trials ahead, the lies Matthew wove, or the grand truth waiting to unfold. For now she walked beside him, the river's song their only witness, her heart vowing to endure. Yolanda sat in the dim glow of her penthouse office, the Mississippi's silver sheen, a distant comfort through the window. Her long, straight hair fell over her shoulders, a cascade of defiance against the chaos threatening to unravel her world. The carved magnolia blossom from Matthew rested on her desk, its petals a silent vow amidst the storm. The $50,000 debt he'd confessed, tied to a failed art program, had shaken her, not for the money, but for the anguish in his eyes. Her boutique, Yolanda's elegance, was crumbling under Simone's relentless sabotage. Vendors pulling contracts, clients abandoning her designs. The city's whispers, laced with racial venom, cut deeper. A black queen tied to a broke white carpenter. Yet Yolanda's heart held firm, her love for Matthew a flame that burned through doubt. But the cost of that love was rising, and the shadows in Matthew's gaze hinted at truths she couldn't yet grasp. She met him at a quiet voodoo shop in the Treme, its shelves lined with candles and charms, the air thick with incense and mystery. Matthew stood by a display of gris-gris bags, his flannel shirt worn thin, his hands fidgeting with a small wooden carving, a heart etched with her initials. His face was taut, his blue eyes clouded with a pain that pierced her. "It's gotten worse, Yolanda," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The debt's climbed. 100,000 now. The bank's threatening my workshop." He handed her a stack of papers, official looking, stamped with liens and demands. Yolanda's heart thudded, not at the sum, but at the despair etched into his features. She didn't know the documents were a lie, a cruel test Matthew wove to probe the depths of her devotion. Her fingers brushed the papers, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "We'll find a way, Matthew. I'm not letting you lose everything." Inside her heart was a battlefield, love warring with fear, not of him, but of the world closing in. She'd already sold designs to cover his earlier debt, and now her boutique teetered on ruin. Simone's latest blow, a social media campaign claiming Yolanda was bankrupt, had scared off her last major client. Yet looking into Matthew's eyes, she saw a man worth fighting for, his pride a beacon in her storm. He shook his head, his voice breaking. You're risking too much, Yolanda. Your boutique, your name. I'm not worth it. The words were a dagger, not because she believed them, but because they revealed his torment. He thought he was her ruin, and it tore at her soul. She stepped closer, her hand cupping his face. You're worth more than any empire. I chose you, Matthew, and I'll keep choosing you. Her words were a lifeline, but inside a quiet fear gnawed. How much more could she give before breaking? The city's cruelty sharpened. At a Creole cultural festival, Yolanda stood among vibrant floats and drummers, her presence radiant in a gown of her own design, its gold threads gleaming like her resolve. But the crowd's whispers were relentless. She's throwing her legacy away for that white debtor, a vendor muttered, loud enough for her to hear. A black woman of her status? With him? The racial sting burned, layering shame atop scorn. Simone, gliding through the festival in a rival gown, leaned in with a venomous smile. Your boutique's finished, Yolanda. Pity you chose a pauper over power. Yolanda's gaze was steel. My heart's richer than your schemes, Simone. But the words masked a growing ache, her confidence fraying as invoices piled up and her staff whispered about layoffs. Her family's rejection was a deeper wound. At a rare gathering in her mother's parlor, surrounded by mahogany furniture and the scent of jasmine tea, Yolanda faced their wrath. Her mother, her face a mask of grief, clasped her hands. Yolanda, you're a Carter. Our blood earned this wealth. Why let a white man's debts destroy it? Jamal, her brother, leaned forward, his voice sharp. He's a nobody dragging you down. You're shaming us all. Yolanda's throat tightened, tears threatening, but she stood firm. You're wrong. Matthew's love is my strength. I'd rather lose everything than lose him. She walked out, their silence a chasm, her heart bruised but unyielding. The boutique's struggles became a public wound. Simone's campaign reached a fever pitch. A local radio host, swayed by her whispers, questioned Yolanda's reckless choices on air. Suppliers demanded upfront payments, and Yolanda spent sleepless nights balancing books, her dreams unraveling like a torn seam. She hid her fears from Matthew, but they seeped into her quiet moments, her fingers tracing the carved heart he'd given her. She loved him, his gentle touch, his stories of rebuilding broken homes, his refusal to let her wealth define him. But the cost was steep, and a whisper of doubt crept in. Not about him, but about her endurance. One evening, in a secluded courtyard draped with Spanish moss, Matthew pulled her close, his breath warm against her ear. I saw a collector today, he said, his voice heavy. The debt's a lien now. They could take my tools, my work. Another fake document, its ink stark, lay between them. Yolanda's heart sank, not for the money, but for the anguish in his eyes. She took his hands, her voice fierce. We'll fight this, Matthew. You're not alone. Her love was a fortress, but inside she felt the cracks. Simone's sabotage, her family's rejection, the city's scorn pressing like a vice. Yet in that courtyard, Matthew's touch was her anchor. He kissed her forehead, his voice a whisper. You're my everything, Yolanda. But his eyes held a shadow, a guilt she couldn't read. He was testing her, weaving a web of lies to measure her heart. And she was passing, though the cost was breaking her. She didn't see the man in the shadows, a creditor watching, hired by Matthew to push the charade further. To her, he was a man fighting to rise, and she'd stand by him no matter the price. The courtyard's moss swayed in the breeze, the city's jazz a distant pulse. Yolanda clung to Matthew, her heart a tempest of love and fear. Simone's schemes, her family's betrayal, and the looming debt were a crucible, forging her resolve. She didn't know the truth he hid, the stage he was setting, or the love that would soon shine brighter than any fortune. For now she held his hand, her soul vowing to endure, the city's lights a fragile promise against the gathering storm. Yolanda leaned against the weathered railing of a St. Charles Avenue streetcar stop. The clatter of the trolley a faint echo to her racing heart. Her long, straight hair caught the breeze, shimmering under the glow of wrought iron lamps. But her eyes were fixed on the carved heart Matthew had given her. its etched initials a talisman against the chaos threatening to engulf her. The $100,000 debt he'd confessed, a lien on his workshop, had carved a deeper wound than she'd admitted. Her boutique, Yolanda's elegance, was a shadow of its former glory, bled dry by Simone's relentless sabotage. Suppliers lost, clients gone, her reputation tarnished by whispers of insolvency. The city's racial scorn, branding her a fool for loving a broke white carpenter, stung like salt in an open wound. Yet Yolanda's love for Matthew burned brighter, a defiant flame against the darkness, even as his shadowed gaze hinted at secrets she couldn't fathom. She met him at a hidden garden cafe in the Marigny, its courtyard draped in ivy, the air thick with the scent of chicory and honeysuckle. Matthew sat across from her, his flannel shirt frayed at the cuffs, his hands trembling as he slid a new stack of papers across the table. "It's worse, Yolanda," he said, his voice a jagged whisper, like a splinter under skin. "The debt's ballooned. 200,000 now. They're coming for everything, my tools, my home." The documents stamped with urgent red ink detailed a foreclosure notice, a fabricated noose tightening around his life. Yolanda's breath hitched, her heart a drumbeat of fear and resolve. She didn't know the papers were Matthew's cruel test, a final gauntlet to prove her love's endurance. Her fingers grazed the papers, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest. "We'll fight this, Matthew. I won't let you lose it all." Her words were a vow, but inside her soul quaked, not from doubt in him, but from the crushing weight of their battle. She'd sold designs, dipped into savings, and now faced the prospect of liquidating her boutique to save him. Simone's latest attack, a billboard in the quarter proclaiming Yolanda's elegance, a falling star, had driven away her last loyal clients. Yet looking into Matthew's eyes, she saw a man whose heart was her home, and she'd burn her empire to keep it. He shook his head, his voice cracking like dry wood. "You're giving too much, Yolanda. Your boutique, your dreams, I'm tearing them apart." The words sliced her, not because she believed them, but because they bared his anguish. He thought he was her ruin, and it broke her to see him so raw. She reached across the table, her hand fierce on his. "You're my dream, Matthew. Everything else is just stuff." Her love was a fortress, but cracks formed, fear that her strength might falter under the city's relentless assault. The world outside their ivy-draped haven was merciless. At a jazz funeral procession, where mourners danced under black parasols, Yolanda walked alone, her presence radiant yet haunted. The crowd's whispers were a venomous chorus. "She's bankrupting herself for that white debtor," a shopkeeper hissed. "A black woman like her, throwing it all away?" The racial barbs cut deep, layering shame atop scorn. Simone, spotting her, sauntered over, her eyes glinting. "Your boutique's a ghost town, Yolanda. Love's a poor investment." Yolanda's smile was iron. "My heart's richer than your lies, Simone." But the words masked a growing dread, her confidence fraying as invoices piled higher than her hopes. Her family's rejection was a raw wound. In a rare call, her mother's voice crackled through the phone, sharp as a whip. "Yolanda, you're a Carter. We fought for this legacy. Why let a white man's debts destroy it?" Jamal chimed in, his tone bitter. "He's a leech, sis. You're shaming us." Yolanda's throat burned, tears spilling, but she held her ground. "You're wrong. Matthew's love is my legacy. I'd rather lose everything than lose him." She hung up, her heart a bruised but unyielding thing, the silence louder than the city's jazz. The boutique's collapse became a public scar. Simone's billboard campaign spread to local gossip blogs, painting Yolanda as a fool chasing a pauper's dreams. A major fashion show dropped her designs, citing financial instability. Yolanda spent nights in her office, her fingers tracing the carved heart, its edges worn from her touch. She loved Matthew, his quiet laughter, his stories of mending broken homes, his pride that refused her wealth. But the cost was crushing, and a whisper of doubt crept in, not about him, but about her ability to hold on. One evening in a lantern-lit courtyard near the cathedral, Matthew pulled her close, his breath ragged. "A creditor came today," he said, his voice heavy as stone. "They're seizing my workshop unless I pay." Another fake document, its ink a cruel lie, lay between them. Yolanda's heart plummeted, not for the money, but for the torment in his eyes. She cupped his face, her voice fierce. "We'll save it, Matthew. You're not alone." Her love was a lifeline, but inside she felt the strain. Simone's schemes, her family's betrayal, the city's scorn pressing like a noose. Yet in that courtyard, Matthew's touch was her salvation. He kissed her palm, his voice a whisper. "You're my everything, Yolanda." His eyes held a shadow, a guilt she couldn't read, as he wove his deception to test her heart. She didn't see the man in the alley, a creditor hired by Matthew, watching their embrace. To her, he was a man fighting to rise, and she'd give her all to lift him. The cathedral's bells tolled, their echo a solemn promise against the city's clamor. Yolanda clung to Matthew, her heart a tempest of love and fear. Simone's sabotage, her family's rejection, and the looming debt were a crucible, forging her resolve. She didn't know the lies he spun, the truth he hid, or the stage he was setting. For now she held his hand, the lantern light casting their shadows as one, her soul vowing to endure the fire. Yolanda stood in the shadow of a live oak, its gnarled branches stretching over a quiet Algiers Point Park. The Mississippi's distant hum a faint solace against her unraveling world. Her long, straight hair caught the twilight, gleaming like a beacon, but her hands clutched Matthew's carved heart, its edges worn from her desperate grip. The $200,000 debt he'd confessed, a foreclosure threat on his workshop, had pushed her to the edge. Her boutique, Yolanda's Elegance, was a husk, gutted by Simone's sabotage. Gossip blogs and a fashion show, snub had dried up her revenue. The city's whispers, thick with racial venom, branded her a fool for loving a broke white carpenter. Yet Yolanda's heart clung to Matthew, a flame refusing to falter, even as his shadowed eyes hinted at a truth she couldn't grasp. Her love was her strength, but the cost was tearing her apart, and she felt the cracks widening. She met Matthew at a weathered dockside tavern in the lower Ninth Ward, its walls scarred with flood marks, the air heavy with the tang of river mud and bourbon. He sat in a corner, his flannel shirt frayed, his face etched with a torment that pierced her soul. "It's over, Yolanda," he said, his voice a broken whisper, like a snapped violin string. "The debt's hit $500,000. They're seizing everything. My home, my tools, my name." He slid a thick envelope across the table, its contents a fabricated foreclosure notice, stamped with dire warnings. Yolanda's heart lurched, not at the sum, but at the despair in his eyes. She didn't know the papers were Matthew's final test, a brutal crucible to prove her love's unyielding core. Her fingers trembled as she touched the envelope, her voice a steady anchor in the storm. "We'll face this, Matthew. I won't let you lose everything." Inside her soul was a maelstrom, love battling fear, not of him, but of the abyss they faced. She'd sold designs, dipped into savings, and now teetered on selling her boutique to save him. Simone's latest strike, a viral video claiming Yolanda was funding a white man's ruin, had sparked a boycott, her storefront now a ghost town. Yet looking into Matthew's eyes, she saw a man worth every sacrifice, his pain her own, his fight her war. He shook his head, his voice raw. "You're losing too much, Yolanda. Your boutique, your legacy. I'm destroying you." The words were a blade slicing through her, not because she believed them, but because they bared his anguish. He thought he was her downfall, and it shattered her to see him so broken. She leaned across the table, her hand fierce on his. "You're my legacy, Matthew. The world can burn. I'll still choose you." Her love was a fortress, but inside, dread gnawed. How much more could she endure before crumbling? The city's cruelty was a relentless tide. At a riverside art walk, where lanterns cast golden pools on the pavement, Yolanda moved through the crowd, her presence radiant yet haunted. Whispers followed like vipers. "She's bankrupting herself for that white debtor," a vendor sneered. "A black queen, wasting her empire on him?" The racial barbs stung, piling shame atop scorn. Simone, weaving through the stalls, flashed a predatory smile. "Your boutique's dead, Yolanda. Love's a fool's gamble." Yolanda's gaze was iron. My heart's richer than your poison, Simone. But the words masked a growing terror, her confidence fraying as creditors called and her staff whispered about unpaid wages. Her family's betrayal cut deepest. In a tense voicemail, her mother's voice was cold as marble. Yolanda, you're a Carter. We bled for this name. Why let a white man's debts erase it? Jamal's message was harsher. He's a parasite, sis. You're shaming us all. Yolanda's throat burned, tears spilling, but she stood firm. You're wrong. Matthew's love is my anchor. I'd rather lose everything than lose him. She deleted the messages, her heart a bruised but unyielding thing, the silence louder than the city's clamor. The boutique's collapse was a public wound. Simone's viral video spread to local news, a reporter questioning Yolanda's reckless devotion on air. Her last supplier cut ties, citing financial risk. Yolanda spent nights in her office, her fingers tracing the carved heart, its edges now smooth from her touch. She loved Matthew, his gentle touch, his stories of mending broken homes, his pride that refused her wealth. But the cost was crushing, and doubt crept in, not about him, but about her strength to carry on. One evening, in a moonlit cemetery where ancient tombs gleamed like ghosts, Matthew pulled her close, his breath ragged. A creditor came today, he said, his voice heavy as stone. They're taking my workshop tomorrow unless I pay. Another fake document, its ink a cruel lie, lay between them. Yolanda's heart plummeted, not for the money but for the torment in his eyes. She cupped his face, her voice fierce. We'll save it, Matthew. You're not alone. Her love was a lifeline, but inside she felt the strain. Simone's schemes, her family's rejection, the city's scorn pressing like a noose. Yet in that cemetery, Matthew's touch was her salvation. He kissed her palm, his voice a whisper. You're my everything, Yolanda. His eyes held a shadow, a guilt she couldn't read, as he wove his deception to test her heart. She didn't see the man in the shadows, a creditor hired by Matthew, watching their embrace. To her, he was a man fighting to rise, and she'd give her all to lift him. The tombs loomed like silent sentinels, the city's jazz a distant pulse. Yolanda clung to Matthew, her heart a tempest of love and fear. Simone's sabotage, her family's betrayal, and the crushing debt were a crucible, forging her resolve. She didn't know the lies he spun, the truth he hid, or the stage he was setting. For now she held his hand, the moonlight casting their shadows as one, her soul vowing to endure the fire. Yolanda stood on the edge of a wrought iron balcony overlooking the French Quarter, the city's pulse, jazz riffs and carriage wheels, vibrating through the humid air. Her long, straight hair shimmered under the gaslights, but her hands gripped Matthew's carved heart, its etched initials a lifeline against the abyss threatening to swallow her. The $500,000 debt he'd confessed, a looming seizure of his workshop, had pushed her to the brink. Her boutique, Yolanda's elegance, was a ghost of its former glory, gutted by Simone's viral smears and a news report branding her a fool. The city's whispers, thick with racial venom, flayed her, a black queen shackled to a broke white carpenter. Yet Yolanda's love for Matthew was a defiant ember, burning through the pain, even as his shadowed eyes carried a weight she couldn't name. Her heart was her armor, but the cracks were deepening, and she felt the weight of her choice like a stone. She met Matthew at a candlelit jazz lounge in Faubourg Marigny, its velvet curtains muffling the saxophone's wail, the air heavy with bourbon and longing. He sat in a corner, his flannel shirt worn to threads, his face a map of torment that clawed at her soul. It's the end, Yolanda, he said, his voice a fractured whisper, like a glass about to shatter. The debt's $1 million now. They're taking everything. My home, my work, my name. He slid a thick folder across the table, its pages stamped with foreclosure notices and legal threats. A fabricated noose tightening around his life. Yolanda's heart staggered, not at the sum, but at the despair etched into his features. She didn't know the documents were Matthew's final, brutal test, a crucible to measure her love's unbreakable core. Her fingers brushed the folder, her voice a steady beacon in the storm. We'll fight this, Matthew. I won't let them take you. Inside, her soul was a hurricane, love warring with exhaustion, not from doubt in him, but from the relentless battle. She'd sold designs, savings, and now faced selling her boutique to save him. Simone's latest assault, a petition from local designers demanding Yolanda's exclusion from a fashion council, had left her storefront barren. Yet looking into Matthew's eyes, she saw a man worth every sacrifice, his pain a mirror to her own, his fight her vow. He shook his head, his voice raw as a wound. "You're losing everything, Yolanda. Your boutique, your name, I'm your ruin." The words were a knife, not because she believed them, but because they bared his agony. He thought he was her destruction, and it tore her apart to see him so broken. She leaned across the table, her hand fierce on his. "You're my everything, Matthew. The world can burn. I'll still choose you." Her love was a bastion, but inside fear gnawed. Could she hold on when her world was crumbling? The city's cruelty was a relentless tide. At a street festival in the Bywater, where drummers pounded and lanterns swayed, Yolanda moved through the crowd, her presence radiant yet haunted. Whispers slithered like snakes. "She's bankrupting herself for that white debtor," a vendor hissed. "A black woman of her stature? Throwing it all away?" The racial barbs burned, piling shame atop scorn. Simone, gliding through the festival, flashed a predatory grin. "Your boutique's dead, Yolanda. Love's a losing bet." Yolanda's gaze was steel. "My heart's richer than your venom, Simone." But the words masked a growing dread, her strength fraying as creditors hounded her, and her staff quit, citing unpaid wages. Her family's betrayal was a jagged wound. In a final letter, her mother's words were cold as stone. "Yolanda, you're a Carter. We fought for this legacy. Why let a white man's debts erase it?" Jamal's note was harsher. "He's a leech, sis. You're shaming us." Yolanda's throat burned, tears spilling, but she stood firm. "You're wrong. Matthew's love is my anchor. I'd rather lose everything than lose him." She tore the letter, her heart a bruised but unyielding thing, the silence louder than the city's pulse. The boutique's collapse was a public scar. Simone's petitions sparked a boycott, and a local TV segment questioned Yolanda's reckless devotion. Her last fabric supplier demanded cash up front, and Yolanda spent nights in her office, her fingers tracing the carved heart, its edges now smooth from her touch. She loved Matthew, his gentle touch, his stories of mending broken homes, his pride that refused her wealth. But the cost was crushing, and doubt crept in, not about him, but about her endurance. One evening in a secluded bayou grove, fireflies dancing like stars, Matthew pulled her close, his breath ragged. "A creditor came today," he said, his voice heavy as lead. "They're seizing my workshop tomorrow unless I pay." Another fake document, its ink a cruel lie, lay between them. Yolanda's heart plummeted, not for the money but for the torment in his eyes. She cupped his face, her voice fierce. "We'll save it, Matthew. You're not alone." Her love was a lifeline, but inside she felt the strain. Simone's schemes, her family's rejection, the city's scorn pressing like a noose. Yet in that grove, Matthew's touch was her salvation. He kissed her palm, his voice a whisper. "You're my everything, Yolanda." His eyes held a shadow, a guilt she couldn't read, as he wove his deception to test her heart. She didn't see the man in the shadows, a creditor hired by Matthew, watching their embrace. To her, he was a man fighting to rise, and she'd give her all to lift him. The bayou's whispers mingled with the city's jazz, a distant pulse of hope and hostility. Yolanda clung to Matthew, her heart a tempest of love and fear. Simone's sabotage, her family's betrayal, and the crushing debt were a crucible, forging her resolve. She didn't know the lies he spun, the truth he hid, or the stage he was setting. For now she held his hand, the fireflies casting their shadows as one, her soul vowing to endure the fire. Yolanda stood at the threshold of a grand New Orleans church, its stained glass windows casting kaleidoscopic light across her path. Her long, straight hair gleamed under the chandeliers, a cascade of defiance against the city's scorn. The million-dollar debt Matthew had confessed, a noose threatening his workshop and home, had nearly broken her. Her boutique, Yolanda's Elegance, was a husk, ravaged by Simone's boycotts and media smears. The city's whispers, racial venom branding her a fool for loving a broke white carpenter, had flayed her soul. Yet Yolanda's heart burned with love, a flame unquenched by loss, even as Matthew's shadowed eyes haunted her. She clutched his carved heart, its etched initials her anchor, and stepped forward, her resolve a shield against the storm. The world had tested her, but today in her white gown, she would vow to Matthew, unaware of the truth about to unfold. The church buzzed with tension, its pews filled with skeptical guests, socialites, vendors, her estranged family, whispering as Yolanda glided down the aisle. Her gown, a masterpiece of her own design, shimmered like moonlight on the Mississippi, its lace trailing like a comet's tail. Her eyes locked on Matthew standing at the altar in a simple vest, his face a mix of love and guilt that tugged at her heart. The violin's jazz-infused melodies soared, magnolia petals strewn across the floor, their scent a fleeting comfort. The crowd's murmurs cut like knives. "She's marrying a debtor," a guest hissed. "A black queen, wasting her legacy on him?" Yolanda's heart ached, not for their words, but for the pain she'd seen in Matthew's eyes. She reached him, her hand finding his, and whispered, "We're here together." His smile trembled, a storm of emotions she couldn't read. As they faced the officiant, Matthew's hand tightened around hers, his voice low. "Yolanda, you've given me everything." Her heart swelled, love drowning out the crowd's scorn. She didn't see the screen hidden behind the altar, or the children from the local youth center tucked in the choir loft, waiting. The officiant's words faded as Matthew stepped forward, his gaze heavy with a truth ready to break free. He turned to the crowd, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "Yolanda chose me when the world saw nothing. Today, I give her my truth." Her breath caught, confusion mingling with love, as he signaled to the back of the church. A colossal screen flared to life, its glow bathing the hall in light. Gas rippled through the crowd as it displayed a bank account with billions, documents clearing every debt, and plans for a youth center named Yolanda's Haven, funded forever. Bold letters shone, "All this wealth is yours forever." A children's choir burst into song, their voices a cascade of hope as Matthew took the microphone. "I'm not a carpenter," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm Matthew Bennett, founder of a tech empire. The debts were a test. To know you loved me for me, not my money." Yolanda's heart stopped, tears spilling as the truth crashed over her like a wave. She'd fought for him, sacrificed everything, and now his love unveiled a fortune. The crowd was a sea of shock. Simone's smirk froze. Her mother's eyes widened. Jamal's jaw dropped. Yolanda's voice trembled, barely a whisper. You're a billionaire." Matthew nodded, his eyes glistening. "I hid it to find a heart like yours. You chose me when I was nothing, Yolanda. Now everything I have is ours." She clutched his hand, her soul a tempest of joy and relief. The weight of their trials lifting. The choir's song swelled, the children's voices a tribute to her sacrifice, and she wept, not for the wealth, but for the love that had carried her through fire. Simone stood rigid, her schemes crumbling as guests whispered in awe. Yolanda's mother rose, tears streaming, and crossed the aisle. "I was wrong," she said, her voice breaking. "You saw his heart, Yolanda. We were blind." Jamal followed, his embrace tight. "You're a queen, sis. You chose right." The racial barbs that had haunted her faded, replaced by respect. As the crowd stood, some clapping, others wiping tears, Yolanda's heart soared, not for their approval, but for the man beside her, his guilt replaced by love. The church was a cathedral of triumph, its light refracting through Yolanda's tears. She turned to Matthew, her voice fierce. "I'd choose you again, rich or poor." He kissed her forehead, his whisper a vow. "And I'd give it all for you." The choir sang on, the screen glowing with their shared future. A youth center to lift New Orleans children, a legacy born of her heart. The city's scorn, Simone's sabotage, her family's rejection, all melted in the fire of their love. As they sealed their vows, Yolanda felt the weight of her sacrifices transform into strength. The boutique's ruin, the debts, the racial venom, they were shadows against the truth of Matthew's heart. She'd fought for him, not knowing his wealth, and now stood in a light brighter than any fortune. The guests, once judgmental, now saw her as a beacon, a black woman who'd chosen love over status, proving its power. The violin played on, its notes a love song to their resilience. The church doors opened, revealing the city beyond, its jazz a pulse of hope. Yolanda and Matthew stepped forward, hand in hand, her gown trailing like a dream. She didn't need the billions or the youth center to feel rich. His love was her treasure. But the truth he'd unveiled was a gift, a testament to her heart's endurance. The crowd's applause followed them, a chorus of redemption, as they faced a future forged in fire and love. Yolanda and Matthew's love, forged in New Orleans' fiery crucible, proved that a heart's truth outshines any fortune. Their journey from scorn to triumph shows love's power over wealth and prejudice. What did their story stir in you? Did Yolanda's courage or Matthew's hidden truth touch your soul? Share your thoughts below. Your voice matters. Thank you for joining their tale, for letting their love light your heart. Rate this story 1 for brilliance or 0 if it missed the mark. Stay with us for more tales that weave hope and passion through life's storms. We'll meet again soon under the city's jazz-kissed stars.